Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 552, and today is March 4th, 2024. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. A lot of news to get through on today's show: the war in Ukraine, a lot of reports about the atrocities that Israel is committing against the Palestinian people. So a lot of important information in today's show. Be sure to share the show. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute. I repost the show on the blog at antiwar.com, YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee for the video version of the show. It's up anywhere you could listen to audio podcasts. And of course, follow me on Twitter at KyleAnzalone_. I tweet out all the articles I write, typically anything posted at antiwar.com, a lot of other just things, stories that I think are important, and of course every episode of this show, so you won't miss an episode that way. And Twitter has this new alarm bell notification feature. If you hit that, it actually notifies you when I put out a tweet, which maybe it's too much and you don't want to do that, but just with the suppression going on, even on Twitter now, one of the really great journalists, Click Karenberg, is now suspended for at least several months, I think, from the platform. So there's certainly some suppression going on, or at least some pro-Israeli boost in the algorithm. So if you hit that notification bell, you probably help me overcome that just a little bit. All right, let's get going. What do we have on today's show? First up here, Haiti. Kenya and Haiti sign agreement to deploy force to Caribbean nation. So the leaders of Kenya and Haiti inked a pact for a Kenyan-led UN mission to the Caribbean nation. Nairobi plans to send 1,000 armed men, dubbed as police officers, to Port-au-Prince, as local authorities have lost all control over the Haiti's capital city. The Joe Biden administration has been working for several years to create a UN force to invade Haiti to restore order. In October, at Washington's urging, the UN Security Council approved a resolution that authorized Kenya to lead a UN police force to Haiti to return power to Prime Minister Ariel Henry, who has faced months of violent unrest in the wake of a 2021 assassination of then-President Jovenel Moïse. The people of Haiti did not elect the government in Port-au-Prince. I'm not sure if there are any elected officials left in Port-au-Prince. For a while, I think there were just a couple of senators left that were still under terms and hadn't resigned and things like that, but including Henry himself. So not long after Moïse's murder, then Prime Minister Claude Joseph resigned at the behest of Western pressure, allowing Henry to assume power in his stead. Since then, armed gangs have seized control over most of the city under Henry's watch, at times occupying critical infrastructure, including the country's main port. After the UN Security Council approved the force, the opposition leader in Nairobi challenged President William Ruto's decision to send Kenyans to Haiti. In January, the Kenyan High Court ruled in favor of the opposition leader, blocking the deployment. Now, there's a lot of other politics behind here, too. The U.S. gave Kenya some military aid. We signed a new defense pact with Kenya. So we bribed the Kenyans to take on this role after we tried to get the Canadians and other countries to take the lead, and they all refused. And so the U.S. and the Biden administration kind of went with Kenya out of desperation here. They gave them all these plans, and then the Kenyan High Court said, actually, our government, based on our laws, can't do this. And then the government kind of just declared that, all we need to do to bypass the court's ruling is to have a bilateral agreement signed between the two sides. And so it seems that is what happened here. So the President Ruto declared that he could skirt the ruling by inking a pact directly with Port-au-Prince. That reciprocal agreement was signed on Friday. Ruto said he and Henry discussed the next steps to enable the fast tracking of the deployment, though the leaders did not offer a timeline for their operation. The U.S. plans to send Kenyans to Haiti has met opposition in Port-au-Prince in addition to Nairobi. Haitians have protested Henry's request for the UN deployment, as U.S. peacekeepers in Haiti have a legacy of rampant sexual abuses and causing a cholera outbreak that killed thousands. The Haitian people have kept the bitter taste of foreign force in charge of our situation: theft, rape, cholera, food dependence, deregulation of economic system, without mentioning the fact that we don't remember seeing the then gang leaders be arrested or rendered unable to do harm. Haitian think tank Group de Travail sur la Sécurité, the Security Working Group, said of Haiti's Henry's initial request. And there's been several protests against Haiti in the Henry in the capital city, as well as groups in the U.S. and Haiti who have signed letters for American politicians and others asking them to prevent this deployment. But it now looks like it's going to go through. Maybe sometime later this month. I've been covering this for the Institute over the course of like 2 years now. The U.S. first trying to get Canada to take on the role and then finally getting Kenya to do it. And so it looks like this plan will finally come to fruition. And one important thing to note here is that the Biden administration really wasn't very interested in this. And even, the Haitian government was making requests in 2022 until a lot of Haitians started showing up at the U.S. border. And so I think initially this was seen by the White House as a way that they could stem the flow of Haitian migrants to the U.S. But it really hasn't worked out that way, of course, because 2 years later, the situation in Haiti just continues to get worse, and this effort to deploy a force to Haiti has hit roadblock after roadblock for Washington. All right, next up here, we're moving to Ukraine. Putin warns West, Russia's nuclear arsenal is on full combat alert. So Putin said in a speech on Thursday that Russia's nuclear arsenal is on full combat alert, a warning that comes after French President Macron said the idea of deploying NATO troops to Ukraine was not ruled out. This is what Putin told Russia's Federal Assembly, which is a address to the joint chamber. So I don't know if it's equivalent to the State of the Union address, but kind of how both chambers fill out one there. So Putin said the strategic nuclear forces are on full combat alert and the ability to use them is assured. Later in his speech, Putin specifically addressed the talk of NATO sending troops to Ukraine. They are selecting targets to strike on our territory and contemplating the most efficient means of destruction, he said, likely referring to the U.S. and NATO intelligence support for Ukraine. Now they have started talking about the possibility of deploying NATO military contingents to Ukraine, but we remember what happened to those who sent their contingents to our territory once before. Today, any potential aggressors will face far graver consequences. They must grasp that we also have weapons. Yes, they know this, as I have just said, capable of striking targets on their territory. Putin said the West was spooking the world with the threat of a conflict involving nuclear weapons, which potentially means the end of civilization. Don't they realize this? The French leader's comments about Western troops in Ukraine drew attention from the fact that there are already a small number of NATO special forces operators in the country, which was revealed by the Discord leaks last year, according to a leaked Pentagon document from March of 2023, where 97 NATO special operator soldiers were listed as being in the country, including 14 Americans and I think over 50 Brits. A European official told the Financial Times this week that everyone knows there are Western special forces in Ukraine. They're just not acknowledging it officially, in response to the French leader's comments that some NATO and some of its members said there are no plans to send combat troops to Ukraine to take on the Russians directly. So it was kind of interesting when Macron made these comments. You had a group of countries, Germany in particular, I think even Poland, who came out, the Slovakia, who all came out and said, like, no, this is ridiculous. And then you had another country, Lithuania, actually come out and bat the idea. And then, also very interesting now, we get these people, and this happens from time to time, right, where you'll have the independent media report something as happening. So, the Discord leads, we know that there's 100 NATO special operators in Ukraine. We all expected it before in the independent media, but we felt like this was some pretty good confirmation that, this was really going on, and we know the scale of it now, and really what's happening there. And the mainstream media just completely ignores that and says anybody who calls this a proxy war is, repeating Russian talking points. They're a conspiracy theorists. This is, just us sending weapons and the Ukrainians are using them. And now, we really have 2 years into the war, a picture of this is 100% a proxy war. There's really no denying it. The Ukrainians have even said that without the American support, this thing would have completely collapsed. And not just the weapons, but the intelligence and all the other information and training and services that the West is providing to Ukraine. And so, and now, you kind of get these officials who everybody knows this is the case, as a way of downplaying or minimizing the significance of what's going on here. Well, it's been happening for 2 years. Everybody knew it was going on, so don't worry about it at all. When in reality, we should be upset that our leadership hid this from us for so long when it was such a massive military provocation. All right, next up here, article I wrote for the Institute on March 3rd. Zalinsky says lack of Western military aid is unacceptable. So the Ukrainian president criticized his nation's Western supporters for not providing enough aid. The leader appeared to criticize Republicans in the U.S. House for playing, quote, political games. He said the lack of aid for Ukraine was unacceptable, and it was needed because Russia only understands strength. So Ukrainian President Zalinsky attacked his backers during Saturday night's address. He said, "When lives are lost and partners are simply playing internal political games or disputes that limit our defense, it's impossible to understand. It's unacceptable, and it will be impossible to forget, and the world will remember this." The Ukrainian military is facing several crucial challenges. Kiev lost the soldiers needed to fight Russian forces. Ukraine recently suffered key losses in the Donbass and risk losing more ground in the coming weeks. Additionally, Kiev's forces are facing ammunition shortages, including artillery shells and air defense interceptors. Zalinsky remarks come as the U.S. Congress is debating a $95 billion foreign military funding bill that includes $61 billion for Kiev. House Republicans are stonewalling the legislation primarily over concerns regarding immigration policy. The White House depleted its funds to arm Ukraine at the end of 2023. I don't really have any updates on what's going on with that legislation. There was a big meeting last week where I think essentially everyone in leadership of this country tried to pressure House Speaker Mike Johnson into agreeing to bring the bill to a floor vote in the House, which I do believe will pass. Now, my understanding is the way they're looking at doing this would be to suspend the rules to pass this. And so then they would need 2/3 and not just a flat majority. Flat majority they will definitely have. I assume that everybody is going to vote for this bill except the House Freedom Caucus, maybe a few other Republicans. So we're probably looking at 50 to 80 Republicans, and then I would say a handful of Democrats, maybe the squad plus, and not even the full squad. I assume that like Ilhan Omar and Tlaib will vote against it. AOC will probably either vote for it or abstain. Over the Israeli military aid is my guess will be their objections. And then there's a few others, Barbara Lee, who all may vote against this over the aid to Israel in the bill. There's $14 billion for Israel, along with the $61 billion for Ukraine. So, I mean, of course it's insulting, right, that Zalinsky is calling this political games. This is the American political process, and that the American people who are, not only in favor of ending the war in Gaza, but also in favor of ending the war in Ukraine and bringing forward negotiations, that our representatives would debate this bill and not just pass whatever blank check Zalinsky wants, is, in a way, too bad for him. He got involved in American politics, and now the American political system is going to run its course. And even if it's bad for him, well, that's just the way it's going to go this time. But the Ukrainians are not happy about the situation here. So Zelensky's remark after initially engaging Russia in negotiations in April of 2022, Zalinsky was convinced by leaders of the NATO alliance that the alliance would support the Ukrainian war effort, and he chose to abandon diplomacy with Moscow. However, after 2 years of war, Kiev's Western backers are struggling to provide more arms to Ukraine. And it's not just the lack of funding. The U.S. also and its Western allies also have a lot of production shortfalls here. Like Russia could just outproduce us in artillery shells and tanks and things like that at this point. So, Zalinsky and Democrats in this country would have you believe that we passed this $61 billion in aid and it's going to wave a magic wand over Ukraine's problems. And it really isn't. Ukraine's in the best situation for Ukraine. Their solutions are months, if not a year away. If you look at how long it takes to train troops, to not just make them able to, go and operate some equipment, but actually understand warfare in a way to not just have a chance to live, but have a chance to be somewhat successful in their operations. If you listen to the reports that Ukrainian commanders are telling, mainstream U.S. and Western outlets like The Guardian and the New York Times and the Washington Post, they're sent nearly untrained recruits who, if they send them to the front lines, will almost immediately get killed. And so there is a lot going on here, and Ukraine needs a lot. And it's not just that they need some more weapons, and it's not just that the U.S. has even an unlimited pile of money to pay. You can't fire U.S. $100 bills at the Russians, right? Like, that's not going to work. You have to build 155 millimeter shells, and we've been sending Ukraine the cluster variant of those for a year now because we haven't had any conventional shells to send them. So, the problems are far deeper than just, we need to pass this bill, as the Democrats and Zalinsky like to pretend. While it's increasingly clear that Zalinsky will be unable to achieve his goals on the battlefield, he is refusing to alter course. During a Saturday night address, he said, "Russian terror must be defeated. It's fundamental. There's nothing they recognize in Moscow except strength. Therefore, we must be more of our strength and unity of the world, unity here in Ukraine." So, Zelensky is still on his same delusional path that there is no other way to go forward here. All right. Now we're going to get into the war in Gaza. This article I wrote for antiwar.com on March 1st. U.S. vetoes UN resolution condemning Israel for Flower Massacre. And the Flower Massacre is the name that has been given to the killing of over 100 Palestinians by Israeli forces on Thursday. We covered that somewhat, not in too much detail on the show last week with Connor, the Friday show. We'll have a little bit more detail on that here. So the U.S. vetoed a UN Security Council resolution condemning Israel for the massacre of civilians surrounding an aid convoy in Gaza, a motion supported by all other member states. The Israeli Defense Forces acknowledged its soldiers fired on the crowd. On Thursday, hundreds of Palestinians were killed and injured by Israeli soldiers as they gathered around an aid convoy near Gaza City. As some people took aid off the trucks, the IDF claimed the same Palestinians approached Israeli soldiers nearby, saying the troops felt, quote, endangered, and then opened fire. The killing has been dubbed the Flower Massacre. So, again, we don't have full details of what's happened here. We have some more than we had last week's show. But, the narrative put forward by Tel Aviv, by the Israelis, is, again, the Palestinians were there. They approached the Israeli soldiers, and the Israeli soldiers fired a few shots at their legs and, a few other shots just to prevent the Palestinians from encroaching too close to the Israelis. Unfortunately, because the Palestinians were already worked up into a frenzy and a mob, the shots scared some of the truck drivers. They drove over some people. Some other people got trampled to death. It's horrific, but the IDF really isn't responsible. That again, is the Israeli narrative on this. Now, what really happened is all these people are surrounding the aid convoy, and it appears that the Israelis just opened fire, and that at least a good chunk of the people that died from direct Israeli gunfire. And I saw some videos of the purported trucks that were, carrying the aid, and they had bullet hits on them. So the truck drivers drove away. It wasn't just because there was already a panic situation. It's because the Israelis fired on them. So this is 100% on the fault of the Israeli troops here. More than 100 Palestinians were killed in the shooting and ensuing panic, while at least 750 others were injured. Tel Aviv has attempted to blame the Palestinians for the deaths, saying the violence was caused by the mob, and Washington claims it needs more information to address the incident. While Israeli troops would bear responsibility for the carnage, whether they fired on civilians or merely incited the stampede, doctors treating victims said most of the injuries were gunshot wounds. Some outlets report that the IDF also fired artillery or tank shells at the desperate crowd. And also, you have to understand here too that even if the Israeli narrative put forward was 100% correct, Israel has starved these people and created all the conditions on the ground for this. So, even if everything Israel has said was correct, they starved these people and created the situation for this. It's absolutely horrific that they then fired on the crowd. It seems that's the case too, that this is not something that requires a whole lot of nuance. It was just a absolute slaughter by the Israelis on the Palestinians desperately seeking food. Again, almost 1,000 killed and injured in this. So horrific. So asked about the incident on Thursday, Washington's deputy UN envoy Robert Wood told reporters that the White House would not condemn Israel's actions, given contradictory reports about how the massacre unfolded. We don't have all the facts on the ground. That's the problem, he said. And, this is just really ridiculous, right? Like, if you had heard that somebody had, murdered someone and then looted their home and burned it down, right? And they said, I killed them, I looted their home, but I didn't burn their home down. I have no idea how their house caught fire. And you say, well, I can't condemn what they did because we don't know if he looted the house and burned it down or just looted the house. And so obviously the affront, the crimes committed here by Israel are so transparent that the U.S. should not have any problem condemning them. The refusal to condemn Israel even for this is policy. We're just not going to condemn Israel for anything. And claiming that there's contradictory facts on the ground is just a very lame excuse. So several of Washington's allies disagree, however, with German Foreign Minister Baerbock stating that the reports from Gaza shook me. The Israeli army must fully explain how mass panic and shooting could have happened. In Gaza, people are closer to dying than to living. More humanitarian aid is needed to come in immediately. The French President Macron similarly voiced deep indignation at the images coming from Gaza, where he said civilians have been targeted by Israeli soldiers. In a post on X, he wrote, "I express my strongest condemnation for these shootings and call for truth, justice, and respect for international law." Thursday marks the fifth time. Actually, I think the vote happened on Friday morning, so I'm mistaking the article here. But Friday morning marks the fifth time that Washington has used its veto to kill a Security Council resolution calling for a ceasefire or condemning Israel's slaughter of Palestinians in the Strip. As one of 5 permanent members of the body, the U.S. can block any motion from passing. With a growing number of Palestinians on the brink of starvation amid dire food shortages, aid convoys have become increasingly face unrest from hungry crowds, most critically in devastated northern Gaza, where aid shipments have all but ground to a halt. Jens Lark, the UN spokesperson for UN humanitarian agency OSHA, explained that the famine is now almost inevitable, and once a famine is declared, it is too late for many people. I've explained this on the show a little bit in the past, but widespread starvation is like the precursor to famine, right? So, you could have widespread starvation without having famine if people are able to get, just enough food, able to eat, a meal a day, a meal every other day, things like that, are kind of able to hold on, survive. Maybe one or two people starve to death. That's not necessarily a famine. When it becomes a famine is when you have a large number of people dying. And so to wait for the label of famine to actually be applied is too late to start acting and rectifying the situation, right? Like that, at that point, you already have people starving to death. The time to act is, before people even get to starvation, but certainly at this point is the time to do it. So the UN estimates that 1 in 4 Palestinians are teetering on the edge of famine. The situation is worse in northern Gaza, where 1 in 6 children are suffering from acute malnutrition and wasting. And as of now, there are 10 reports of Palestinian children who have starved to death in the Strip. In response to the Hamas October 7th attack, top Israeli officials declared that Gazans would be cut off from food, water, fuel, and other aid. Tel Aviv has largely followed through with that threat, only allowing a trickle of aid into the besieged enclave. And by the way, they're actively tightening the noose. This is something that I don't think Americans understand, and it's probably surprising because there is, the Biden administration is saying, oh, we're pressuring Israel to allow more aid. Oh, we're pressuring Israel to allow more aid. And so you would figure that more aid is getting into Gaza, or at least the same amount. But actually, it's been pretty steadily decreasing since the start of the conflict. And now we're under 100 trucks a day entering. I think the average in February was 90, and it was ticking down during the month, not up. And so I think during 1 week, the third week of February, the average number of trucks getting in was around 50 a day. It is absolutely horrific. So rather than having Israel just allow more aid into Gaza, with the threat of, if you do not, you will not get another bomb from us. You will never get another dollar from the Americans. We will vote at the UN Security Council that not only are you conducting a genocide in Gaza, but you've also carried out all these massacres. The U.S. has a ton of leverage that it could use over Israel. And what happens? We airdrop a few meals into Gaza. So aid groups slam U.S. for dropping aid into Gaza instead of pressuring Israel. Aid groups are criticizing the U.S. for dropping humanitarian assistance into Gaza by airplane instead of pressuring Israel to allow more aid trucks into the Strip, where the entire population is facing crisis levels of food insecurity. On Saturday, U.S. Central Command announced it was conducting a combined humanitarian assistance airdrop into Gaza with the Royal Jordanian Air Force. The command said a U.S. C-130 military transport plane dropped about 38,000 meals on Gaza, which is populated by about 2.2 million people. The international charity Oxfam said the airdrops mostly serve to relieve the guilty conscience of senior U.S. officials whose policies are contributing to the ongoing atrocities and risk of famine in Gaza, and call for the U.S. to end its military aid to Israel. While Palestinians in Gaza have been pushed to the absolute brink, dropping a paltry symbolic amount of food into Gaza with no plan for safe distribution would not help and be deeply degrading to the Palestinians. And that was from Scott Paul, who leads the Oxfam government's U.S. advisory. He continues, instead of indiscriminate airdrops in Gaza, the U.S. should cut the flow of weapons to Israel that are used in indiscriminate attacks, push for an immediate ceasefire, the release of hostages, and insist that Israel uphold its duty to provide humanitarian aid, access, and other basic services. Dave Hardin, a former USAID official, said the airdrops show the U.S. government is weak for not putting more pressure on Israel. The airdrops are symbolic and designed in ways to appease the domestic base. Really, what needs to happen is more crossing opening and more trucks going in every day. I think the United States is weak, and that's really disappointing to me. And think about this, that we care so little about the Palestinians. The White House, the Biden administration, Joe Biden, the president of our country, cares so little about the lives of starving Palestinian babies, rather than putting more pressure on Israel to reverse what they are doing in Gaza, rather than to even leverage any amount of U.S. aid, any amount of support that the U.S. gives to Israel in order to get them to allow just more aid trucks in, right? We're not even talking about a ceasefire. Just allow more aid trucks into Gaza. That's all the White House has to pressure Israel to do. And not only are they not doing that, but then they're doing these symbolic things like airdropping aid. So they're acknowledging that there's a massive problem in Gaza, and the American people are sick of watching starving children across the Middle East at our hands. We're sick and tired of it. We're done with these foreign wars. We want no more of this. And to try to alleviate those concerns so we could continue sending more unfettered aid to Israel, we're going to do this publicity stunt. It's just sick, right? It's sick to do a publicity stunt on, oh, I'm feeding people, when you're not feeding people, you're not helping people. In fact, this is just to cover up to allow the war to go on more and more and more. So U.S. officials have acknowledged to Axios that the airdrops have only a limited impact, since a U.S. military plane could only drop the equivalent of the amount of aid 1 or 2 aid trucks can carry a day. The UN has warned that at least 500,000 Palestinians in Gaza are facing catastrophic levels of deprivation and starvation, and a massive famine is expected if the situation on the ground doesn't significantly change. And Dave has here that the number of Palestinian children that have starved to death is now over 15. So again, you know, this is all symbolic. This airdrop of aid is symbolic, and you know, it does help a few tens of thousands of Palestinians for a couple days, but it allows Israel to continue the genocidal campaign against 2.2 million. And the White House knows this. This is intentional, right? Like, it's getting harder and harder to think that, oh, the White House is run by this bumbling fool, Joe Biden, and there's just so much disorganization. That's why these atrocities are just allowed to go on and on and on. And now it seems very intentional that the White House is almost working in coordination with Netanyahu, in coordination with Tel Aviv, to make sure that there is a sufficient level of propaganda to allow Israel to continue these just slow genocidal grinding campaign against the Palestinians. All right, next up here, Air Wars documents Israel killing Palestinian civilians following International Court of Justice ruling. So Air Wars looked into several reports of Israeli airstrikes on civilian targets in Gaza for the 2 weeks following the International Court of Justice's ruling that Israel was plausibly committing a genocide in Gaza. Air Wars reports, Air Wars research identified more than 200 alleged incidents of harm from January 27, 2024 to February 9th, 2024, originating from more than 1,500 open source claims. These claims include local media outlets, testimonies from family members, and other witness testimonies posted online. Each incident was identified by corroborating at least 5 sources detailing the civilian harm events. Though there are likely to be other incidents that were not publicly reported upon. However, this research intends to provide a starting point for further investigation. Among the claims, Air Wars has identified attacks on journalists, on civilians while sheltering in displacement centers, on civilians waiting for humanitarian aid, and on healthcare workers. So I thought that was pretty damning. And then this one as well. This is from Forensic Architecture, which is a organization I wasn't too familiar with. Laura Portress, who was along with Glenn Greenwald and Jeremy Scahill, one of the founders of The Intercept, sits on the board. So I assume this is like a pretty close to mainstream kind of outlet. So a new report from Forensic Architecture looks into 8 claims made by Israel at the International Court of Justice and deemed Tel Aviv to be spreading lies and misinformation. Many of the lies told by the Israeli representatives at the court involved misrepresenting civilian infrastructure as military target. One of the claims discussed in the report is that the Shifa hospital was a legitimate military target. Forensic Architecture concluded, "We found the the Israeli legal team's claims about tunnels that ran for hundreds of meters directly under the hospital to be inconsistent with previous claims by the Israeli military and therefore misleading and unreliable. We found the Israeli claims that the hospitals have not been bombed to be false, considering the 11 direct strikes on Shifa alone. We have also found strikes aligned sporadically with where the Israeli military claims the tunnels to be. There's been no evidence provided to justify strikes on the Israeli military. And there are 7 other of these situations if you want to go and check out their article and kind of look through all the different lies that Israel told. They would just, any Palestinian carrying anything is always an RPG, right? And so, if you're carrying something over your shoulder, which is probably a way that you're going to carry something, at least for a certain amount of time, if you're walking a long distance as a displaced person, well, then Israel is going to say, oh, you're carrying something over your shoulder. It's an RPG, it's a gun. And they've just used that as excuses, these grainy videos, to rain hell down on the Palestinians in Gaza and hit civilian targets. All right, next up here, I wrote this one for the Institute on March 3rd. UN report finds Palestinians sexually abused and beaten in Israeli detention. So, this is an article that I have written a few times now as more and more reports have come out on it. This isn't the first one. This is, I think, the 5th or the 6th serious report I've seen documenting this so far. But this one is from the UN Palestinian Agency, UNRWA, and they found rampant abuse of Palestinians in Israeli detention facilities. The detainees report frequent beatings, sexual abuse, and even the death of prisoners. Thousands of Palestinians have been rounded up by the Israel Defense Forces in Gaza over the past 4 months. The New York Times viewed the UNRWA report and said that the document and that documents pervasive abuse in Israeli detention camps. So the report has not been made public yet, and I'm just kind of relying on the New York Times summary of it. It could be even worse than what the New York Times says. The New York Times really tries to offset all the horrors that the Israelis are inflicting on the Palestinians by saying, oh, remember what happened on October 7th. Oh, remember what happened on October 7th. Like, in any way, October 7th would justify taking some Gazan from his home and then beating him nearly to death and torturing him. Those two things just really aren't related in this way. If Israel is systematically rounding up and torturing Palestinians, then that's just on its own needs to be reported. So, detainees said they were beaten, stripped, robbed, blindfolded, sexually abused, and denied access to lawyers and doctors, often for more than a month, the New York Times wrote. Some detainees, according to the report, told UNRWA investigators that they had been beaten on open wounds, had been held for hours in painful stress positions, and had been attacked by military dogs. So this is starting to sound an awful lot like Abu Ghraib, the U.S. prison during the Iraq War, which, I think almost all Americans look at as hugely shameful on our legacy and hugely problematic for what the U.S. did in Iraq and was, at least in part, a huge contributor to the Sunni insurgency against the Americans, just systematically beating, humiliating, degrading thousands of men is a way to ensure that, you will be hated for generations by that population of men. So one prisoner reported that he was, quote, beaten so badly that his genitals turned blue and that there is still blood present in his urine, adding that guards made him sleep naked in the open air next to a fan blowing cold air and playing music so loudly that his ears bled. The draft document describes a range of ill treatment that the Gazans of all ages, abilities, and backgrounds have been reported facing in makeshift Israeli detention facilities, such treatment, the report concluded, was used to extract information or confessions, to intimidate and humiliate, and to punish. Some of it, according to this report, wasn't even about information. It was just about humiliation and punishment, indiscriminate humiliation and punishment of the Palestinian people. Absolutely sick that our government is allowing this to happen. All right, several outlets and agencies have reported severe abuse in Israeli detention facilities that could amount to torture, including Israeli outlets plus 972 magazine and Haaretz. This is what Haaretz reported. Detainees and prisoners in northern Israel have reported several cases of harsh violence and abuse carried out by prison wardens. The torture included guards kicking, punching, hitting their testicles, and humiliating prisoners. Some testified that a prisoner who was beaten died of his injuries. And then 972 magazine, which is a Tel Aviv-based outlet, reported Israeli soldiers subjected Palestinian detainees to electrostops, burned their skins with lighters, spat in their mouths, and deprived them of sleep, food, and access to bathrooms until they defecated on themselves. Some testified to have been beaten all over their bodies and having cigarettes extinguished on their nets and bats. Several people known to have died from the results of being held in these conditions. Israeli forces appear to be arresting Palestinians indiscriminately. According to the UNRWA report, several Gazans in Israeli detention have been barred access to lawyers. Some of the detainees have conditions such as Alzheimer's disease, intellectual disabilities, and cancer. The UN report also put a spotlight on the sexual abuse suffered by Palestinians at the hands of their Israeli captors. Both male and female detainees report incidents of sexual abuse. Some male detainees said they were beaten on their genitals. The report said, according to the Times, some women said they experienced inappropriate touching during searches as a form of harassment while blindfolded. And I've read, more extreme reports of what women have faced in detention from other UN sources. But, it's all very, very damning and very horrific. And of course, it's so obviously hypocritical too, right? Where any US politician, if anything is said that, Palestinian, if you go and you say 15 Palestinian children have starved to death, they will say Hamas raped women, Israeli women on October 7th, which, has now been largely debunked. Not to say we don't know the, maybe extent of some rape on October 7th, but certainly, the systematic rape that was claimed, even the New York Times is walking away from that claim from their huge reporting. They haven't issued a retraction yet, but we just ran a story. We've ran a lot of stories at antiwar.com from either Brad Pierce or Matt Blumenthal that have documented this as the news has slowly come out over the past couple of months. But we ran another article from several authors at The Intercept where they go through several reports of how this is all kind of fallen apart, all the claims, and that the New York Times has actually told them that they have walked back from their claim that there was systematic rape and just that, some people were raped. So this is, huge that what the U.S. is claiming happened to the Israelis, which gives them this green light to kill tens of thousands of people in Gaza, is now happening to the Palestinians, and the U.S. doesn't even condemn Israel for it. Next up here, Netanyahu breaks off hostage talks with Hamas. I wrote this one on March 1st. So Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu told Egyptian and Qatari officials that Israel will not engage in another round of talks until Hamas provides a list of living Israeli hostages in Gaza. This news is a blow to President Joe Biden, who predicted a peace deal would be done as soon as today, as we're talking on the show. Now, it seems that Netanyahu did follow through on this threat. Dave DeCamp has an update here on March 3rd. A Hamas delegation arrived in Cairo on Sunday for a hostage deal talks, but the Israelis have boycotted the negotiations. Netanyahu broke off hostage deal talks because Hamas did not provide a list of all the living Israeli hostages. Sources in the Israeli security cabinet criticized Netanyahu's demand in comments to Haaretz. As with the previous deal, one could assume there would eventually be proper limits of hostages and those no longer living. This didn't need to be made into a deal breaker for advancing the negotiations, one source said. A potential deal that is on the table is for Hamas to release about 40 Israeli hostages in exchange for a 6-week ceasefire and the release of hundreds of Palestinian prisoners. Hamas has been seeking a permanent ceasefire and Israeli withdrawal from Gaza, but there were signs on Sunday that the Palestinian group could be more flexible on demands. A senior Hamas source told a Lebanese outlet that the deal could be reached despite obstacles being put in the way by Israel. So the Hamas source said, quote, despite these obstacles, the possibility of reaching an agreement is still viable, especially as the occupation is being dealt heavy blows in Khan Yunis and the Al Zaytun neighborhood. Citing Arab media, Haaretz reported that Hamas source said the group could be flexible on the length of the ceasefire and the number of Palestinian prisoners that would need to be released. Both Hamas sources said they are standing firm on two conditions: Israel allowing displaced Palestinians to return to northern Gaza, and the delivery of much more aid to the north. So, one more thing on this subject that I need to bring up. There was a lot of reports yesterday that Kamala Harris had called for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. What she called for is this deal to be implemented. She said an immediate ceasefire, and then she paused in the way that Kamala Harris does and says that for at least 6 weeks. And so it's like she wanted the soundbite of her calling for a ceasefire. I think she did it in Selma, which of course, the civil rights history there. So I think she wanted that soundbite, but in reality, she was just calling for this deal. And look, if you're not going to put pressure on the Israelis to do something about it, then calling for it to happen really doesn't make a difference. I guess it's maybe one of the first times that a U.S. official has said that they want a ceasefire, although, she just then went on to explain that I'm using the word ceasefire, but I mean humanitarian pause, which is the Biden administration position. All right, next up here, Israeli Minister Gantz arrives in U.S. on trip not approved by Netanyahu. So Israeli War Cabinet Minister Benny Gantz arrived in the U.S. on Sunday on a trip that was not approved by the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu. According to Israeli media, Netanyahu wasn't aware of the trip until Gantz informed the Prime Minister of his plans on Friday in a tense phone call. A source told the Israeli news outlet Ynet that Netanyahu made it clear to Minister Gantz that the state of Israel only has one prime minister. Gantz is the leader of the National Unity Party and is scheduled to meet with Vice President Kamala Harris on Monday. In his speech on Sunday, Kamala Harris called for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, but quickly clarified that she meant a 6-week truce, which is on the table as part of a potential hostage deal. While the White House told the New York Times that Gantz and Harris are expected to discuss hostage negotiations and the potential for a temporary ceasefire, Israel boycotted the latest hostage deal talks that were held in Cairo on Sunday. Gantz is also set to hold talks with Secretary of State Antony Blinken, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, and Brett McGurk, President Biden's top Middle East official on the National Security Council. Gantz is portrayed as Netanyahu's moderate opposition, but Gantz supports the Israeli slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza. He recently threatened that Israel will invade the southern Gaza city of Rafah, which is packed with 1.5 million Palestinians, if Hamas doesn't release all Israeli hostages by Ramadan, which begins a week from Sunday, which is March 10th. Any full-scale assault on Rafah would incur huge civilian casualties, as most of the Palestinians sheltering there are living in tents on the streets. The U.S. has given Israel the green light to kill civilians in the city, since it won't impose any consequences on Israel if it does, and will continue to provide unconditional military support. All right, next up here, settlement expansion. So, Israel announces new West Bank settlement expansion in defiance of White House. Israel approved the building of 3,600 Israeli homes in a new West Bank settlement. The announcement came just days after Secretary of State Antony Blinken declared the settlements were inconsistent with international law. Tel Aviv routinely ignores Washington's request to curtail its oppressive treatment of Palestinians without impact on the billions in aid the U.S. provides to Israel each year. So, Israeli Finance Minister, that's Smotrich, approved the new Jewish homes on Palestinian land south of Jerusalem on Tuesday. We will continue the momentum of settlement throughout the country, he said. Smotrich has denied the existence of the Palestinian people and called for the segregation of maternity wards. The approval of the settlement is a snub to the White House, as last week Blinken restated a pre-Donald Trump policy of viewing Israeli settlements in in the West Bank as inconsistent with international law. Our administration maintains a firm opposition to settlement expansion, and in our judgment, this only weakens, doesn't strengthen Israel's security, Blinken said. He added that the settlements were inconsistent with international law and counterproductive to reaching an enduring peace. Now, this is just rhetoric, but seeing how the U.S. gives Israel $4 billion every year, and the White House is doing everything it can to get Congress to give Israel another $14 billion this year, you would think the Israelis would think to themselves, well, we're going to appease and do our pals in the White House a favor, and we're at least going to wait a couple months before we now announce a new round of settlement expansion. But they do it later that day, almost like, a way of spitting in the face of the Americans and say, not only are we not going to listen to you, but we're not going to listen to you. We're going to tell the world publicly, and you're still going to give us all of our money. So, in addition to building new Jewish homes, Tel Aviv has also been destroying Palestinian homes. Israel has destroyed nearly 100 Palestinian homes since October 7th. Tel Aviv then bills the Palestinians for the cost of destroying their homes. Last week, Smotrich explained the policy was to punish the Palestinians. Our enemies know that any harm to us will lead to more construction and more development and more of a hold over our country. Collective punishment, settlement building, and military occupation are all violations of international law. President Joe Biden, who claims his foreign policy is centered on a respect for liberal international order, has still refused to curtail U.S. support for Israel or even condemn Tel Aviv's many flagrant violations of humanitarian law. Secretary of State Lloyd Austin told Congress last week that the U.S. has shipped Israel over 20,000 bombs since October 7th. So just unfettered support for Israel at extraordinary levels. Speaking of extraordinary, Biden campaign taking extraordinary steps to prevent pro-Palestinian protests at events. I wrote this one for antiwar.com on March 1st. The Joe Biden re-election campaign has taken several steps to curtail pro-Palestinian supporters from interrupting his speeches. The campaign has gone as far as keeping rallies small, avoiding colleges, and not informing the public of location events. Through much of January, the president was met with chants of Genocide Joe at least a dozen times. Pro-Palestinian protesters labeled the president Genocide Joe because of his unfettered support for Tel Aviv as Israeli forces committed brutal slaughter in Gaza. In response to the protests, the campaign hired Doug Landry to prevent further demonstrations. Landry has worked on planning logistics for past presidential campaigns. According to NBC News, the president's re-election campaign has taken, quote, extraordinary steps to thwart the pro-Palestinian protesters by making their events smaller, withholding their precise locations from the media and the public until he arrives, and avoiding college campuses. A Biden ally said, but the downside is that it means he doesn't reach as many voters. The point is to reach as many voters as you can. Those small events don't. Many of the president's events have become off the record, meaning unpublished, stops that are with private businesses or residents. The campaign is considering hiring a private company to vet attendees for a major event with former presidents Bill Clinton and Barack Obama later this month. The policy has succeeded in isolating Biden from his support from critics of his support for Israel. However, there are downsides regarding his prospects for winning the 2024 election. Democratic Party campaigners have also increased the ticket prices for events featuring Biden, hoping to make it prohibitively expensive to protest the president. One Democratic staffer said the president will eventually have to address the American people. I think at some point you'll have to see him those big rallies and big crowds, because that's ultimately is how you get large swaths of voters, a Democratic ally of the campaign explained. The problem for the president is that his policy of unconditional support for Tel Aviv as Israeli forces commit massacres in Gaza is just unpopular. A January poll found that around half of Biden's 2020 voters believe Israel is committing a genocide in Gaza. A recent data for Progress poll found that 67% of Americans support a ceasefire, including roughly 80% Democrats. Additionally, a recent survey found that 50% of Democratic voters want a candidate who does not back sending military aid to Israel. President Biden supports sending an additional $14 billion in weapons to Kiev. So, pretty big disparity between what the voters want and what the president wants. It'll be interesting to see how this plays out. The Democrats are really trying to demonize any opposition to Israel as being anti-Semitic. I don't think it'll work in the long term. And one of the things that the campaign, I think, has tried to do is with having Biden doing these smaller events, they're having Jill Biden do more. And she was recently denounced for supporting genocide at an event. And so it's not like you're going to be able to, roll out surrogates for the president. This is so hated, and people are so sick of this war in Gaza that I think it's going to be very difficult for them to hold these events without being interrupted. And I think, how far the administration is going to prevent it is going to cost them the election if he just, plays this out and goes as is until November. And so it's huge in that respect. But, how far they're going just shows how much of an impact that the protesters are having. So if anybody's considering it, I would say, go out and harass members of the administration. I mean, nothing physical, of course, but just tell them the truth that they're helping and absolutely supportive of a genocide going on in Gaza. Now, last week we had over 100,000 vote uncommitted in Michigan primary to send a message to Joe Biden over the support for Gaza. So this was big. Biden still received 640,000 votes. So 100,000 was not, a fifth of them or anything like that. But it is a pretty significant number, especially in a swing state where Biden did not beat Trump by that many votes. And so this would certainly cost him the election should it go on. Now, mentioning protests going on here, we have one from Sam Husseini that is from his Substack, and we reprinted on the blog at antiwar.com. Jane Doe, who immolated herself at Israeli consulate in Atlanta last year, is still alive. So a woman who set herself on fire with a Palestinian flag outside of the Israeli consulate in Atlanta on December 1st. And now, according to the Atlanta Fire and Rescue Department, the woman who referred in their report as Jane Doe is still alive in stable condition at the Grady Memorial Hospital, where she has been since she set fire to herself. After repeated requests for her name, the department stated to this reporter, Sam Husseini, in an email that it does not include the identities of victims. Repeated inquiries to Grady, which is a public hospital, went unanswered. The hospital houses the Walter L. Ingram Burn Center, and so that's probably where she is. Jane Doe is reported to be 27. When asked if they had made any comment to the public that she was still alive at this entire time, the official at Atlanta Fire and Rescue Department said they share the latest update with local media via email on 12/21/23. The release stated the victim remains hospitalized in critical condition. The security guard who attempted to assist the burn victim has been released from the hospital. Several internet searches on that quote show no public result, though this would also indicate that Jane Doe went from critical to stable condition without public notice. And of course, Aaron Bushnell, the airman who died, carried out a similar act just days after. All right, everybody, that's where I'm going to wrap up the show for today. I will have, I'm sure, a lot to talk about this week. I have a few other stories on like Lebanon and Yemen that I didn't get to in today's show. So it'll be a busy week here. I will be on with Judge Andrew Napolitano, Judging Freedom, today at 3:30 p.m. If you don't see it, I'll, tweet out and stuff like that if you don't listen to the show in time. Everybody, thank you so much for tuning in, and do what you can to support.